Let me proceed with the first question. And before I proceed, you just have to bear in mind that I'm an older person. I've studied a lot. And so I can answer each question. I could take 10 hours answering each question. And at some point, you should feel free to say, okay, uh, let's move on to the next question. Otherwise, I may go on too long just on this question, especially as I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the theory of Zionism. So I possess more than the average amount of knowledge. Having said that, I want to take the second question before the first. I don't see there's any particular utility in giving an exposition on what is Zionism. First of all, I don't think there is a thing called Zionism. It doesn't denote any particular ideology, in my view, and it certainly doesn't denote any particular political practice that you can identify concretely. Benjamin Netanyahu, obviously the Prime Minister of Israel, he calls himself a Zionist. Noam Chomsky also calls himself a Zionist. When a term embraces such a wide spectrum of political opinion, going all the way from Noam Chomsky at one end of the spectrum to Benjamin Netanyahu at the other end of the spectrum, it seems to me the reasonable conclusion is it doesn't denote anything with enough specificity that it's useful as a term. And so even though I, so to speak, have a material stake in the notion of Zionism, because after all, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the topic, I still feel that term is better discarded, better set aside when we're trying to have a illuminating and clarifying political discussion. Now, having said that, I want to bring your question up to date. The term of the day is no longer Zionism, it's become apartheid. So if you look at the most recent human rights report from B'Tselem, which is the leading Israeli human rights organization addressing Israeli crimes in the occupied territories, they recently put out a position paper in which they described Israel as an apartheid state. Similarly, this past week, Human Rights Watch, which is the leading human rights organization in the world, it put out a very large report running to over 200 pages. They put out a large report in which they too invoked the crime of apartheid and said Israel was culpable for committing the crime of apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories, meaning the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. I personally do not believe that's politically very useful. Why? Because most of the people who invoke that term have a clear historical memory of apartheid in South Africa. So when they talk about apartheid, their mind immediately, their historical imagination immediately reaches back to South Africa during the years of the apartheid regime, and then climaxing in the release of Nelson Mandela and the dismantling of the apartheid regime. But for most people in your generation, and when I refer to your generation, I mean roughly, as I can see from the screen, most of you are 20 something or even late, and or maybe just hitting 20, since you're freshmen and sophomores, you could be 19 and 20. For most of you, apartheid means nothing. It's 30 years ago. Apartheid was began to be dismantled in 1990s, 30 years ago. So for your historical memory, it's kind of a blank. And I don't think it's particularly useful if it doesn't denote something specific in your mind. On the other hand, B'Tselem described Israel as based on the principle of Jewish supremacy. Human Rights Watch described Israel as based on the principle of Jewish domination. Those terms, I do think, have a concrete resonance for your generation, for any generation. The idea of a regime based on Jewish supremacy or Jewish domination, it obviously leaves a sour taste in your mouth or worse. And so as we head forward, and in my opinion, the political landscape is changing, that now we used to, up until a few months ago, we talked about Israel here, a legitimate regime, the occupied territories there, what Israel is doing in the occupied territories, illegitimate, but Israel itself, legitimate. That, so to speak, political discourse is now changing. Now, the legitimacy of Israel itself is being called into question because it's being accused, not just in the occupied territories over there, but in Israel proper, what's sometimes called pre-June 1967 Israel. It's being accused of creating a regime based on Jewish supremacy or Jewish domination. And so as we head forward, I would prefer to drop the term Zionism. I don't think it denotes anything. Drop the term apartheid because it means nothing to your generation, and to use terminology which does resonate for your generation. We in the United States have become very sensitive to the question of white supremacy and white domination. Those terms resonate as living realities. And so as we in the United States are supposed to be fighting white supremacy and white domination, it means something to most Americans when they hear that Israel is a Jewish supremacist regime practicing Jewish domination. So I prefer to use the terminology of supremacy and domination rather than Zionism and apartheid.
Okay. So part of the tension that exists between, I guess I'll just put it, advocates of Israel and advocates of Palestine, is that advocates of Israel believe that anti-Semitism is connected in some meaningful way to what I guess we would describe as anti-Zionism, or you said criticism of Israel, the delegitimization of Israel as a state. And the IHRA, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, put forward a definition of anti-Semitism that explicitly stated this. I'll put the link for everyone to see in the chat below, but basically the working definition is anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, or Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. And among the examples given, most notably is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, which is basically the principle that I think belies or most Palestinian advocates are committed to, the right of return for Palestinians. But this, while many countries and organizations have adopted or endorsed this definition, it nevertheless remains non-legally binding. So it doesn't really carry any legal ramifications to express opinions that betray this definition. If it is non-legally binding, why should we care about this at all? Or should we care about it at all? And what purpose does enforcing this definition achieve?
There are many things to say about that because there's a lot of background that you probably are not familiar with because it's not as of yet well known. So let's try to go through it step by step. Number one, as a preliminary, I don't see any need for a definition of anti-Semitism if you want to fight anti-Semitism. You define exactly what you want to correct, rectify, or oppose. So we have many laws prohibiting discrimination based on sex, based on religion, based on ethnicity. We have a vast legal apparatus designed to counter all those forms of discrimination. None of those laws ever required a definition of what do you mean by racism? What do you mean by sexism? What do you mean by anti-Semitism? We never had those kinds of laws. Excuse me, we never had those kinds of definitions. We simply had definitions prohibiting certain kinds of discrimination in public facilities and also, to some extent, private facilities, or what came to be called, the term was public accommodations. So somebody can own a restaurant, a private restaurant, but the restaurant is a public accommodation, so you can't discriminate between those who wish to patronize that restaurant. So it's a public accommodation, though it's privately owned. And we have all sorts of laws prohibiting discrimination without any need for defining anti-Semitism, or, as I said, without having to define racism, without having to define sexism, without having to define transphobia, anti-gay discrimination. We just have discrimination laws. That's all that's required. Similarly, on a college campus, we have basic rules about what can and what can't be said. What are the parameters and, if need be, limitations on freedom of speech. But these kinds of parameters or limitations never require the definition of anti-Semitism. These are parameters and limitations which apply across the board. Whether you're Black or white, gay or straight, Jewish or Gentile, we have broad parameters, as we have broad parameters prohibiting discrimination. We never needed a definition. Why are we suddenly in need of a definition in order to address and rectify the problem. I don't see the need. Number two, if you look at the definition that you cited, those, I think it's 2 sentences, it's a completely meaningless definition. A certain this, it may be that, well, it may be this, it may not be this. If it's a certain this, well, what is the certain this? It's a completely meaningless definition. And in fact, the proponents of that definition have acknowledged they don't care about the definition. They have no interest in the definition. What they're interested in is the examples of anti-Semitism. Now, it happens that the examples they give, 7 of the 11 examples, they have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. They're about Israel. They're not about anti-Semitism. They're about curbing, criminalizing criticism of Israel. Now, there's a very brilliant young scholar, a little bit older than yourself. He's 30, yourselves, I should say. And for his doctoral dissertation, he did extensive research into the origin of this IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition. And what he discovered is, in fact, the bodies, B-O-D-I-E-S, the bodies that Israel supporters claim adopted this definition and the examples, they did no such thing. They adopted the definition. They did not adopt the examples. This is calculated misinformation, or the technical term for calculated misinformation is disinformation. It's disinformation. The presiding body of the IHRA did not adopt the examples. They adopted only the definition. Now, this may sound also technical to you, and you're free to yawn. I understand that. But there's a critical principle at stake. The people behind this definition are trying to curb, trying to restrict basic principles of freedom of speech, and in particular, criticism of Israel. And that's unacceptable. It's not only unacceptable, I think it's positively sinister. Now, let's take one example that you gave from the examples of alleged examples of anti-Semitism. Israel's right to self-determination. As an abstract principle, well, presumably they have a right to self-determination. However, you have to look at it in the concrete. How did Israel realize its right to self-determination? Not some abstraction, in concrete. How did it realize it? It realized it by expelling 90% of the population that lived within the borders of what became the state of Israel, what came to be called the Palestinian refugees, and which currently number, the figure given by Human Rights Watch in its most recent report, they number about 5.7 million refugees and descendants of refugees. That was the first step in Israel's concrete realization of its self-determination. In other words, it created its Jewish majority by expelling 90% of the indigenous population. Number two, along with or attendant upon creating this Jewish majority, It confiscated the private property of the Palestinians who were expelled and the Palestinians who remained. Currently, they number 1.6 million. They confiscated the property. Now, 93% of the land in Israel is what's called state-owned land. 93%. It's state-owned land. And that state-owned land is, by law, it's codified. It's for Jews only. It's for Jews only. The Palestinian Israelis, they come to about 19% of the Israeli population. I'm leaving aside the occupied Palestinian territories. I'm just talking about Israel. They occupy they're approximately 19% of the population, but they are confined to 3% of the territory in Israel. And they are denied access to 93% of the land. So you have to ask yourself, not in the abstract, do Israeli Jews have the right to self-determination? You have to ask yourself concretely, did they have the right to expel 95% of the population in order to create what they call as their goal, their objective, in order to create a Jewish majority in Israel? Number two, did they have the right to confiscate the land that was owned and which was inhabited by the Palestinians who were expelled and the Palestinians who still live there, about 1.6 million, as I said, 19% of the population, in order to create land, 93%, the use of which was and is, not was, still is, earmarked only for Jews. Now that's the concrete question. So when you ask me, do Israeli Jews have the right to self-determination? I say in response, it depends on what form it takes. If the form it takes is massive expulsion, forcible removal of the indigenous population, and denial of access to the land for 19% of the population, if that's what you mean by self-determination for Jews, my answer obviously has to be no. But if I say no, I am now, according to the IHRA examples, I'm guilty of anti-Semitism. Well, here's the paradox, if I might call it that. Human Rights Watch is the most prominent, most influential, and the largest human rights organization in the world. It's also utterly mainstream. It's not radical. It doesn't pretend to be radical. It's a mainstream human rights organization. In their most recent report, the one to which I referred, everything I just said now, everything I just said, all the numbers, all the statistics, everything, I took it from the report. I just quoted you the report. I have it sitting right here. I just quoted you from the report. Everything they said, every single word that came out of my mouth in answer to your second question, I quoted from the report. So I have to ask all of you who are listening, you think Human Rights Watch is anti-Semitic? Do you think it's anti-Semitic? I don't. Its executive director is Kenneth Roth, son of survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. He's eminent personality in the United States. I don't think he's anti-Semitic. I don't think the organization is anti-Semitic. The whole point of those IHRA examples is to deny me the right to say what I just said, to deny Human Rights Watch the right to say what it said in its report, because now it's coming under attack for being anti-Semitic. Google it now, Human Rights Watch, anti-Semitic, and you'll see it pop up on the screen. So that's the import of the definition. First of all, that definition is separate from the examples, but the IHRA wants you to believe it's part of the definition, those examples. It's not. And the purpose is not the definition. The purpose is to smuggle in the examples in order to stifle any criticism of the state, any substantive criticism of the state of Israel.
On college and university campuses all across North America and in other English-speaking countries whose governments are generally friendly to Israel, we've seen a lot of demonstrations in support of Palestine, in support of the right of Palestinians, the right of return for Palestinians, like the Boycott, Divest, Sanctions movement and Israeli Apartheid Week, which has become a regular occurrence, I think, here at U of T. And the student body representatives, student unions, have generally taken that tone, that position as well. So we've seen, I guess, students have the freedom to take such a, I guess, controversial position, and faculty has stepped up in support of the right to express those opinions. But on the other hand, we've also seen professional consequences for academics and scholars who have done the same thing. Like, for example, Stephen Saleda, who was offered tenure at the, or was up for tenure at the University of Illinois, had it taken away from him because of a campaign launched by wealthy donors who did not take kindly to his positions on Israel. You yourself at DePaul University were up for tenure. And I think actually you had been approved for tenure by the Political Science Board, if I'm not mistaken. But it was the Board on Promotions and Tenure that I guess adopted the minority position or took the minority position. John Mearsheimer, Stephen Waltz. Even here at the University of Toronto, we had a law professor or jurist, international jurist, who was up for a position, the directorship of the International Human Rights Program, before that decision was canceled. And now the Canadian Association of University Teachers Council has alleged that this was because of a political campaign brought on by, once again, a wealthy donor who was, I guess, disturbed by some writing that she had on the Palestinian occupation of Palestinian territory. So basically what these examples are supposed to illustrate is that there's not that much of academic freedom afforded to academics who take these kinds of positions. Given that that's the case, how difficult is it to challenge the foreign policy consensus on Israel? And if you will, speak a bit about your own experience dealing with this at DePaul and in other universities as well.
I'm going to forego speaking about my own experience because I save my self-pity for my friends, and they have to bear with it. I don't like to play the martyr in public, especially because what's painfully obvious, the suffering of the Palestinian people looms rather larger than myself. You can see from Zoom, I live in a perfectly well-appointed apartment. I have sunlight, fresh air. I'm not going to complain about my fate, at least not publicly. Um, but I want to look at the broader question. And the broader question is actually an interesting one. For the longest time, Israeli propaganda, its propaganda apparatus, was extremely effective, very convincing, and public opinion was overwhelmingly supportive of Israel. And that was pretty much the case until it began to change around the 1990s, which is before you were born, but well past when I was born. And for the period where the Israeli propaganda machine functioned very effectively, convincingly, they never feared public debate and discussion because they were confident that they would win, that the general wisdom of the times was Israel was a David fending off the Goliath in the Arab world by virtue of their ingenuity, brilliance, and good godly fortune. They managed to survive, and they're engaged still in a war of survival, what they like to call an existential threat to their survival as a state and as a people. That worked very effectively. But then, for various reasons, which time doesn't allow me to go into, public opinion began gradually, slowly, incrementally, some would say too slowly, it began to change. And Israel's public reputation began to fall into decline. As Israel's reputation began to fall into decline, they were no longer as confident that they would win the battle for public opinion. The debates, the arguments on college campuses, the dueling speakers. We would bring in a Palestinian, they would bring in an Israeli soldier. We would bring in a representative of the PLO, they would bring in a representative from the Israeli government. The dueling speakers. But the title of one of my books is called Knowing Too Much. The subtitle is Why the American Jewish Romance with Israel is Coming to an End. The point being, Israel, with all of its power, with all of its sophistication, with all of its organization, it couldn't block out anymore the truth. Slowly but surely, the truth started to seep in. And the truth, to be told, the truth is very ugly. It's very ugly. And it's not a new ugliness. If you look at the Human Rights Watch report, they trace the ugliness right back to the beginning, 1947. The state was created on the basis of expelling the indigenous population, confiscating all land that didn't belong to Jews. And the process didn't just end in 1947. It's like this juggernaut. They keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And as we speak now, we see it in Jerusalem. still stealing people's homes, still relentlessly confiscating the land, forcibly removing them. It's a interminable, relentless process. It's very hard to cover that up. They were very successful for a very long time. And now I return to your question. When it became impossible to win the battle for public opinion through the normal give and take of public discourse, they start to operate behind the scenes. They start to resort to strong arm tactics. They start to resort to threats. If you don't stop this criticism, the donors said, we're going to stop giving you money. There's not going to be any more alumni contributions. Universities are wholly dependent on those alumni contributions, their endowments. They're wholly dependent on that money. Jews happen to be very rich. In the United States, I don't know the case in Canada, in the United States, they are the wealthiest ethno-religious group. They also tend to be on the liberal end of the spectrum, and they also tend to give to public facilities, museums, libraries, hospitals, and universities. And universities. And then the threats start coming in. If you don't get rid of that guy, we're not giving you money. Many people blame Alan Dershowitz, Professor Alan Dershowitz, for my fate at the pool. I actually don't think that's correct. I think it was donors and real estate owners who sat on the board of trustees of DePaul University. DePaul University is a very big real estate owner in Chicago. I think it was the pressure from them. And it's the same thing as the situation now with the professor who was denied her place. It's not just the sinister machinations from behind the scenes that I would want to call attention to. I would also want to focus on the fact that the reason they're resorting to these strong arm tactics is because they know they lost the battle for public opinion. To just give you one example, the Israeli supporters, as you mentioned, they've been fighting Israel Apartheid Week. It's anti-Semitic. It's anti-Semitic. We don't want this Israel Apartheid Week. And for a while, it looked like they were going to win. The people who were sponsoring the Israel Apartheid Week were very much on the defensive. And then lo and behold, what happens? Israel's most respected human rights organization, B'Tselem, it puts out a position paper about 2 months ago, and I'll read you the headline, the very first words. The title, A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, colon, this is apartheid. That's the headline. If you doubt me, Google it. Human Rights Watch puts out a report last week. Without going into the details now, which would consume too much time, It says Israel is practicing apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories. How then, since this is a meeting about freedom of speech, how then can you deny students the right to hold an Israel Apartheid Week when the main human rights organization in Israel, the main human rights organization in the world say it's apartheid? That poses a real problem for Israel supporters. My point being, they are very, very rapidly losing the battle for public opinion. Actually, they've lost it. And that's why they resort to the tactics that you described, the donors, the strong arm tactics, because they can't stifle that freedom of speech anymore. They're losing. The moment these two reports came out, they can no longer fight Israel Apartheid Week. They lost. So now the pressure, the tightening of the screws from behind the scenes will increase because they can't win that battle for public opinion anymore. Who's going to support them now? You're kicking out families who've lived in these homes for generations in Jerusalem because you claim, well, before 1948, Jews owned that territory. Okay. You want to go back to pre-1948? Is that what you want to do? Fine. Pre-1948, you own 6% of Palestine. That's how much territory you own, 6%. So how about giving back to the refugees the 94% that you stole? If we're going back to before 1948, then let's give it back. All of it. Not just at home in East Jerusalem. You say Jews owned it. So you want to take it back. Okay, fine, take it back. But then you have to give back that 94% of the land that you stole from that Palestinian population. You want to do that? You want to do that? You want to go back? Let's go back. I mean, what they're doing is insane. It's a completely lunatic country. It's off the spectrum. It's lost all legitimacy. And I'll tell you my own opinion. It's a self-inflicted wound. I began by saying, for the longest time, the consensus was Israel is legitimate. We're just going to focus on the occupied Palestinian territories. And the consensus was give the Palestinians a state in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, give them a state. Israel will be its state, for the Jewish state, and let's just end it. But the Israelis wouldn't accept it. They wouldn't accept it. They want more and more and more. For those of you who know the children's story, the magic fish. The fisherman throws out his line, casts his line, gets a fish, catches a fish, it's a magic fish. He's willing to grant the fisherman whatever wish the fisherman wants. The fisherman lived with his wife in a tiny hut. She asked for a house. She got the house. She was satisfied for a week, but then she says to her husband, go back, catch the fish. She now wants a castle. Well, you get the picture. Eventually, she wants the stars, the moon, the universe. The fish says, you got too greedy. At the end of the story, the fisherman and his wife are back in their little hut. The Israelis, the insatiable greed, the arrogance, the Jewish supremacy, as Betzelem called it. And now it's an irony. It's an irony. It's a paradox. The international community was willing to accept basically accept Israel as a Jewish state with all of its significant flaws. Just give the Palestinians something. Give them something. But the Jewish supremacists, they didn't want to give them anything, nothing, nothing. They're just slaves. They're here to serve us, and better if they're gone. And now the consensus is changing. They're saying, this whole this Jewish majority, this Jewish supremacy, this Jewish domination, not just in the occupied Palestinian territories, but Israel itself, it's unacceptable. And so now the whole enterprise is being called into question. And as I said, it's an irony because there's a self-inflicted wound. You folks obviously are much too young to remember. These sorts of reports, they were unthinkable even 10 years ago. They were unthinkable. Nobody questioned the legitimacy of Israel. They were just questioning Israeli policy in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now the whole thing is being called into question. The legitimacy is being called into question. They did it to themselves. They did it because of my government and your filthy, wretched government, the government of Justin Trudeau. Unlike his father. I remember Pierre Trudeau. I don't know how much you know about your history, but Pierre Trudeau, he's credited with creating the whole idea of multiculturalism that originated in Canada. He was a decent guy. I don't want to sing his praises. I don't want to get carried away, but he was clearly a very decent guy. And Canada, every single year, I don't know if it's still the case, but I remember in my day, Canada was known as the country which had what was the term, the sort of like, it was a place where people would most want to live in the world. Every single year, Canada was ranked #1. And I remember, because I go back a ways, when you would go to a place like Toronto, and there were a lot of Palestinians and Arabs living there. And if you would ask them about it, they would say, I'll quote you because I remember it very clearly. They would say, well, it's no fun to be a refugee. But if there's one place in the world I would want to be a refugee, it's Canada. And a beautiful reputation. And then starting with Stephen Harper and now this Justin Trudeau, it's because of them, and because in particular the United States, Canada is obviously secondary, but because of people like Trudeau and our government, that they never put any limits on Israel. They never put any limits, restrictions. You're going too far. And the Israelis got completely carried away. Completely carried away. Over the top. Over the top. It's not a lunatic state, completely lunatic state. That's why if you look at the public opinion surveys, aside from one country in Africa, and I can't remember which one, there was only one country in the world where the population, not the leadership, the population overwhelmingly loved Trump. It was Israel. It's an insane country with no limits. The disgusting former minister of not law. What was Irving Kotler? What was Irving Kotler? He was your minister of what? You don't know?
No, that's for my time.
No, Erwin Cutler is still,
Attorney General. Well, here we don't
yeah,
have a
former
minister of
Attorney
law.
General.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, people like Erwin Cutler, who from behind the scenes protect Israel from any criticism. You know, when the state of Palestine was admitted to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, there was only one state in the whole world, I take it back, only one state in the ICC. The ICC has 133 countries, members. Only one state, one, objected to the admission of the state of Palestine to the ICC. You know what the one country was? Canada. Yes, it's true, Canada. They are responsible for what has happened because they let Israel do whatever it wanted. No restrictions, no limits. Everything goes. You can, as the Human Rights Watch, not the Human Rights Watch, the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations pointed out, during the Great March of Return by Gazans trying to break out of their prison non-violently, it said the Israeli snipers were targeting children, targeting medics, targeting journalists, and targeting disabled people, people in wheelchairs, targeting them. You think your government criticized it? You think your former Attorney General Erwin Cutler criticized it? This was just murder in broad daylight, targeting children, medics, journalists, and disabled people. That's why it's come to be what it is. Had restrictions been put on Israel, had limits been placed on it, actually, I think what would have happened is there would have been a two-state settlement, and Israel probably would have had legitimacy for its policies of preserving a Jewish majority by expelling the indigenous population and reserving 93% of its land just for Jews. That never came up before. Now it's on the table. It's on the table because people have soured on this whole idea of a Jewish state because its practical incarnation, namely the state of Israel, it's a lunatic state. Can't get around it anymore. Can't get around it.
Okay. I think we're going to open up the floor for questions now. If anyone in the audience, anyone attending has a question, this is time to raise it. You can just, if there's more than one, okay, everyone's got their hand raised. All right, so I guess we'll start with Ingrid. You can ask a question.
Hi, thank you, Professor Finkelstein. I just wanted to ask, do you think the recent shift in the international consensus on Israel and the new language describing it as a Jewish supremacy state, do you think it's also, in some part at least, linked to the rise of Black Lives Matter and the discourse on white supremacy in the United States, or are the two completely separate?
You know what? What's your name?
Ingrid.
You know, that's actually an extremely smart question. It gives me hope for the younger generation because that's exactly what I've been thinking the last few days. That's exactly what I've been thinking. I'm trying to understand, where is all of this coming from? It's a complete shock to me. to be reading these reports, position papers, saying things. I've been involved in this since 1982. I've never heard it before. Where is it coming from? And the last few days, I could even show you the correspondence if we have a private correspondence. I've been writing to friends of mine saying, I kind of think it has a lot to do with the Black Lives Matter, because the Trump era brought to a head this whole discussion of white supremacy. And the reaction to that was the Black Lives Matter. And I think it kind of sensitized human rights organizations. Well, if you're really trying to fight white supremacy and white domination, well, here we have a state that says we're going to do what it takes to preserve a Jewish majority, and we're going to make sure that 93% of the land only goes to Jews. And as I'm reading the reports, I'm going to go through the legislation and the practical implementation of legislation. And I'm thinking to myself, Jesus Christ, if this were ever attempted in the United States, the outcry, the indignation, could you imagine if the United States, 93% of the land was only reserved for white people? It's in Israel, there are 400 towns, 400, where the town has the right to exclude any non-Jew from being a resident. They have the right, they have the legal right to exclude any non-Jew from being a resident. Could you imagine that in the United States? And I think you're totally correct. I think part of what explains it, I was just writing to a friend yesterday. I said, I think the biggest part that explains it is the Black Lives Matter. So, I devote my life to these things, and you just maybe give a few minutes of thought to it, and it was absolutely correct. I mean, it's, in my opinion, that was just a really sharp observation.
Next, Tigran.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for coming and for an interesting conversation. My question is twofold. Firstly, you spoke about the fact that in America and in Canada too, let's say the pro-Israeli lobby, the Jewish lobby, has a very big impact in terms of the donors and academia and even in government through things like AIPAC. But now with the conversation gradually changing, as you say, what do you see will be their reaction, and how can let's say people with an anti-Israeli position fight against, let's say, such influential forces? And the second part of the question is, if the trend is changing and let's say the legitimacy of Israel is being questioned, then what do you see as the best case realistic scenario for the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially since Israel has like a rumored strategy called the Samson Doctrine, which basically implies that in the case of existential threat to Israel, they will release all of their nuclear weapons into neighboring states. Thank you.
Well, once again, it's a very informed question. I will say three things. Number one, my guess is Israel supporters are now in panic mode. These recent reports, and I'm told there are going to be new reports issued by Amnesty International and Palestinian human rights organizations, in which they're going to effectively say the same thing as Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem. I think it's going to put them in panic mode. They'll probably become more desperate in their strong arm tactics. Right now, it's machinations behind the scenes. My guess is they're going to try to tighten the screws even more, prevent people like me from speaking anywhere. But Human Rights Watch As I said, it's not a radical organization. And it too depends on donors. And my suspicion is, my hunch is, they weighed the factors and they reached the conclusion that their donor base, their constituency, which is, as I said, not on the fringes, this is not a radical organization, but well within, let's just call it the 1/3 of the spectrum that we call, there's a left third of the spectrum, there's a center, and there's a right. Within the 1/3, which you might call the left end of the spectrum, that's where they are situated, Human Rights Watch, with also quite a large part in the center. I think they reached the conclusion that their constituency is ready for this report, which means a large chunk of American public opinion has moved significantly away from Israel. And that to me is a very indicative fact about where we are now. It's not just Human Rights Watch per se, it's the milieu, the ambiance that it represents, which is the liberal, also center of the political spectrum. How will Israel react? What will Israel do? Oh no, the question was, where are things going politically in terms of resolving the conflict? My own view is we have to wait and see. I have to wait to see in these demonstrations in Jerusalem right now. As many of you are probably aware, it includes people coming from Haifa, Palestinians coming from Nazareth in these very large caravans, which Israel tried to stop, the bus caravans. And a new leadership will probably emerge, and we'll have to see what are its demands. What will it demand? I have to wait and see. The international community, the human rights organizations represent one aspect, one facet of this thing called the international community. There's also the General Assembly of the United Nations. There's the International Court of Justice. There's the International Criminal Court. I have to wait and see what the reaction is there. So that's just a long way of saying that in terms of political objectives, we're in a transition period. And I have to wait and see, first, what are the demands made by the Palestinians? And second, how those demands resonate with the other organizations and instruments of international politics.
Okay, next speaker, Ahmad.
Hi, thank you, and thanks for your patience. Dr. Finkelstein, I've been a fan of yours for a long time, but as I've grown older, and I'm probably the age of the parents of most people on this forum, I've grown to disagree with you a bit. So one of the things I want to challenge is, and that's quickly, is your definition of Zionism, and then secondly, or the lack thereof, and secondly, the fact that Israel should exist. So, and I'm going to start this way. So, I think, for the sake of discussion, that there is a definition of Zionism. Within that definition, there are just different ideas of how it should manifest itself. And I think the examples you gave are the best ones. So Netanyahu, of course, is a Zionist. Chomsky is a Zionist. Both of them differ as to how that state should exist or what should be inside of it. But they do believe that a Jewish state should exist in this place called Palestine. And if we want to be really honest, to the extent that you have been decided this issue for yourself, you have said that you are a Zionist. I would say that I believe that your ideas are more aligned with Chomsky's. That is, you want a Jewish state, one that acts responsibly. It is a state that will accept material reformations in order to be a good place. And I also believe that you enjoy the company of people who are not Jewish, so you can enjoy a coffee in Tel Aviv or Haifa with someone who isn't Jewish. But the idea of a Jewish state is one that you believe. I do agree with you on that it should exist. I do believe that your criticism of the use of the term of apartheid is correct. Apartheid in South Africa and the facts on the ground, and even the intent of those whites who sought to have a white political state are different than what's in Israel. Principally, the principal differences are that the apartheid system in South Africa would tolerate blacks there just without political power. In the state of Israel, the point of it is just to get them out by any means necessary. So I am a person who is fundamentally opposed to the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. But I do believe a Jewish state should exist. I believe one should exist in Europe, and it can be parceled out in 6 different spaces that are interconnected and include Jews then moving back into that space. And the reason I say that is because for over the last 80 years, we've had a million or trillion reasons to show why a Jewish state in the space of Palestine or even in the Middle East is not workable. Every aspect of that place has been left unbalanced or under development as a result of the Jewish state, and this is without dispute. So I'm finished now. Thank you for your time, and also thank you guys for the forum.
Well, I'd like to begin by making some factual corrections. Number one, Professor Chomsky, whose work I know quite well, and who I could count for the past 40 years as being a close friend. I only mention it because obviously we've had conversations on this topic. He never in his life, even for a millisecond, ever supported a Jewish state. He was always a binationalist, and he found on many grounds the notion of a Jewish state to be unacceptable. Speaking for myself, I don't know where or when I was ever quoted as being a Zionist, but I'm not. It never actually interested me as a question or as a kind of political allegiance. Before this seminar formally began, I mentioned to a couple of the people who I met in this program that I was a Maoist in my youth when I was your age, and several years thereafter till I was about 27, I think. And Zionism was never on my radar. I don't believe, as a matter of principle, I don't believe in states, Jewish or not Jewish, white or black, Hindu or Muslim. I don't believe in ethnic states, racial states, or for that matter, any states. Uh, for my generation, that was considered an abstraction. For your generation, meaning those of you who are roughly in your 20s, it's no longer an abstraction. It's a material reality. Number one, the ease with which you travel now from country to country. Up until the age of 20, I never stepped out of the United States. The first time I stepped out of the United States was when I went to Mont Royal Park in Montreal, is it? Where is Mont Royal Park in Canada? Is it in Montreal?
Yeah, I think so.
Right, I was 20 years old. Now, people your age, they travel all around the world as if it were next door. The planet has radically diminished in size. All of the main problems confronting your generation, the prospect of nuclear annihilation, the prospect of climate annihilation, the problem of the global refugee problem, the breakdown in large parts of the advanced capitalist world of the capitalist system. It's no longer able to generate a better standard of living for the new generation as compared to the previous generation. The functioning of an economic system is generally measured by its ability, slowly but surely, to improve the standard of living of each new generation. But our capitalist system has reached, at least in parts of the world, has reached an impasse. Nowadays, most young people in their 30s, they're still living with their parents, or they're living four to a house, four people renting together, strangers to each other, renting to a house. That was unthinkable, my generation. Unthinkable. We went to college, we moved out, we got our own apartment. That was the normal scheme of things. Nowadays, people can't marry because they can't afford a residence. They can't have children because they can't afford it. They don't have jobs. Jobs, as we understood it, when we were growing up, a job meant 40 hours a week, 2-day weekend, 3-week vacation, health coverage, pension, retirement. That's what a job meant. That now applies to about 20% of people your generation. Most people your generation, they have 3 what they call gigs. In the United States, it's called gigs, dead-end jobs, no benefits, no holidays, no health insurance, no nothing. That's it. So climate change, nuclear conflagration, the capitalist system, these are all challenges that can't be solved within the framework of a nation state. They can't. How can you solve the climate change problem within the framework of a nation state? You can't do it. So my beliefs as a young man, a world without states, was an abstract belief, but now it's become a practical reality. The planet won't survive. First of all, the planet's much smaller than when I was growing up. Nowadays, so many of my friends go back and forth to China. That was in my day. Couldn't happen. Couldn't happen. For us, a big trip was going to Europe. For me, the big trip was going to Canada. You know, So I was never a Zionist. I'm not a Zionist. I don't know where you came up with that. I'm not offended. I'm just saying as a practical matter, Zionism for me is just, it's this tiny ideological issue. It's about whether Jews want a state or don't want a state. I just find that a very claustrophobic world to operate in. I try to think in terms of humanity as a whole, which is not that big anymore. It's a tiny pebble spinning in the universe, a grain of sand spinning in the universe.
I got you. The only thing I was, and I'm not going to drag this out, but in the beginning, both Netanyahu and Noam Chomsky claimed to be Zionists, and then you said you know that Chomsky isn't one. So that's a change of.
No, he is one, but that was my point. You want to make Zionism into the belief in the Jewish state. But Professor Chomsky saw Zionism as a way, like his father, as a way to recreate the Hebrew language and Hebrew culture. They didn't care about the state structure. And the truth of the matter is, if we want to give a fair representation of reality, I would say it's correct to say that the Israelis did manage this small miracle, but for some people it's meaningful. Professor Chomsky, his family was steeped in Hebrew culture. They weren't allowed to speak English at home. It was only Hebrew. And it is true that the state of Israel resurrected the Hebrew language. It was a dead language. And they turned it into a living reality. And if that's something that's important to you, then it's an achievement. Now, it happens not, I'm not passing judgment. I'm saying it just happens not to be something important to me. But to the family into which he was born, the Hebrew language was an extremely meaningful aspect of their life. And for them, they were called, broadly speaking, they were called cultural Zionists. And cultural Zionists were not committed to this or that kind of state. They were committed to reviving Hebrew culture and, in particular, the Hebrew language.
That's not a fact on the ground, though. I mean, it doesn't have an impact on the ground. It just doesn't. I support that. If someone's Yiddish, I support that as well. I think cultural expressions should be protected, but the death of someone else in the world is a very different issue, and unavoidably Palestine.
I don't want to, there are other people here, and I don't want to just enter into a dialogue between you. But I'll just say, because I'm not a polemicist anymore. I was at one point in my life. I'm not anymore. I would say part of what you say, I agree with. Part of what you say, I agree with. But where I think we disagree is, I want to persuade people. I want to win over people to try to make the world a better place. And part of trying to persuade people is using a language people understand and not using a kind of esoteric jargon which does not resonate with the broad public. For 99.999% of Canadians, Zionism means nothing. For all they know, it's a hairspray. But if you say to 99.99% of Canadians, hey, Human Rights Watch just came out with this report that said Israel's a state based on Jewish domination and at the expense of the Palestinian people. Or you say, hey, Israel's main human rights organization, it says that Israel's state is based on Jewish supremacy. And that's a problem if you're not Jewish and you live in that state. Most people understand that.
That's fair. That's fair. Thank you.
You're
Very
welcome.
Okay, Dr. Finkelstein, it is 5:30.
Mhm.
If you'd like to stay a little longer, we have a few more people who'd like to ask questions.
I'm having some guests come over, but I left my door open and they're going to quietly come in. And when they've all assembled, then I will cease the program.
Okay.
And if you folks are interested, as it happens, I've been writing a book called Cancel Culture, Academic Freedom, and Me. And I deal at some length with all these issues of freedom of speech and academic freedom. And if you'd like me at some point to come back and we directly address that, I'll be happy.
Great. So yeah, to everyone who has a question, I just try to be mindful of the time we have. So I guess we'll start off with Ali.
Sure. Thanks for the talk today. Well, I guess just to sort of wrap things up is, do you have any words of encouragement to students that, especially now with what's going on in the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the videos that are coming out, because I actually believe that on top of Black Lives Matter, a huge reason that there is a shift in the dialogue towards Israel's actions is because of the technology that's accessible and the videos that are being produced. But what type of words of encouragement do you have to students who may be scared to speak out against this issue or against Israel's actions because of stuff like the Canary Mission and other situations that may have impediments on their future career? Because I know, as someone like personally who is outspoken about this issue, I am also mindful of the implications, and I try my best to be as good of a person and to remain as non-anti-Semitic as possible, but while keeping in mind that Israel has committed a lot of actions, in my opinion, against humanity that need to be called out.
Well, first of all, the concerns are real. They're not imagined. There are nasty people in nasty organizations who want to make life difficult for you for saying things that they don't want people to hear. That's a reality. It's not a paranoia, and it's not anti-Semitic to say it. It's a palpable reality. Number two, I say the best strategy is don't speak for yourself. Just cite the reports. Say, I'm not saying it, they're saying it. I'm just quoting them. It's not my opinion. I'm just quoting what these respectable organizations are saying. And if you have a quarrel, your quarrel is not with me. Your quarrel is with Human Rights Watch. Your quarrel is with B'Tselem. Your quarrel is with the 1,000 or more organizations, researchers that Human Rights Watch cites in the footnotes to its 214-page report. So I think these are powerful weapons, these reports, but they're also very powerful protection. You don't have to any longer go out on the limb and say things which you'll be prosecuted for as being anti-Semitic. You could just cite mainstream publications now. And I think that's a more persuasive route. And it's actually a personally safer route to be citing these publications. And thirdly, I recognize your concerns about your futures because, as I said, it was very different in my day. When we went to college, I don't remember a single conversation with a single person, ever, never once, a single conversation with a single person about what we're going to do when we graduate. The assumption was, when we're ready to work, there's going to be a job. And you know what? The assumption was true. There always was a job. When you're ready to go to work, there's going to be a job for you. College is your opportunity not to worry about work, not to worry about paying rent, not to worry about food on the table. College was a time for you to explore, to learn about yourself, learn about what you desire, what you want to do with your life. That's what college is about. Trying to figure out, what am I going to do with my life? Your generation doesn't have that luxury anymore. You have to walk into college already worrying about whether I'm going to get a job, whether this major is going to help me get a job. And there's no room to explore anymore. I don't know about the Canadian scene, but in the United States, it's so expensive. So you can't even talk about exploring, because when I went to college, it was free. Everything was free. No, that's no exaggeration. I don't know what tuitions are like in Canada, but in the United States, it's completely out of hand. It's become ridiculous what's happened to our whole system. So we had those luxuries, and so when you have to worry about your future, yeah, you do have to worry about whether one of these nasty organizations are going to cause you problems. It's true, and I'm not going to deny it. I don't. My credo in life is never quarrel with facts, and that's a fact. It's a problem, and then you have to decide what's important to you. And are you going to always live a life of fear? Or are you going to, suppose you call, take a chance? All right, it may cause me some trouble. You know, even in my day, I'll tell you, even in my day, people worried. I had friends who wanted to go to medical school, who were aspiring doctors. In fact, they made it as doctors. And we went to demonstrations against the war in Vietnam. And they were very concerned about having an arrest record because it would prevent them from getting into medical school. And it would. It would. It wasn't hypothetical. It was real. And I remember having those soulful conversations with friends who had to choose between getting arrested at a demonstration against the war in Vietnam and that black mark on their record preventing them from getting into medical school. So we too have those dilemmas. We too. And that's a personal question. It's a question of judgment, and you have to decide for yourself how to resolve it. There's nobody there to answer that question for you, because it's a balancing act. And which side you choose, it's a matter of judgment, and each of us has a different calculus of judgment.
Anna?
Thank you for a very interesting talk today, Professor. My question, actually, I feel it probably pertains to what is just you discuss in your book. I was going to ask, what do you have to say to people who, because recently on social media, at least on my social media, most of the people posting, sharing things to their stories are posting pro-Palestinian things, and a number of them are complaining that Instagram is taking down and censoring these pro-Palestinian videos and footage. And so I was wondering what you have to say to these people who agree with social media's censorship of conservatives, but complain when the same thing happens to them.
Listen, this is a kind of heartwarming discussion I'm having, because you're asking all just really smart questions. It gives me hope for your generation. I think that's a real problem that you're describing. That what's called the left is politically correct, cancel culture left, is calling on places like Facebook, places like Instagram, places like Twitter to censor statements or opinions that they don't like. And first of all, in my opinion, if you're interested in truth, if truth is of value to you, then as John Stuart Mill put it in On Liberty, the only way that you can know whether something you believe is true actually is true. The only way you can know whether what you believe is true actually is true is a standing invitation to the world to prove you wrong. That is, letting everybody who disagrees with you speak. If you can answer all of their objections, you're probably pretty close to truth, though not necessarily possessing the truth, but you're pretty close. However, if you stifle objections, you can't possibly know whether what you think is true is true. And if truth is an important value to you, then you are preventing your acquisition of truth. So, as a general principle, I oppose all censorship because censorship means you are denying certain people that standing invitation to prove you wrong. That's what censorship is. You are denying certain individuals that standing invitation to prove you wrong. And if you deny them that, then you can't know whether what you think is true actually is true. And the second thing is exactly what you just pointed out. It ends up back as a practical matter, not as a theoretical matter, as a practical matter. It ends up backfiring. You want that censored? Fine. And now they're going to censor you because they don't like what you're saying. They don't like what Trump is saying. So they're going to censor Trump. And next thing you know, well, they don't like what you're saying because it's in their minds anti-Israel, and they're going to censor you. And then you have no answer because you said it was okay to censor Trump. So you're just opening the door to your own censorship, to the censorship of you. So politically, it's a complete disaster. All these people I've never been on the social media. I know it'll surprise you. I've never been on Facebook. I've never been on Twitter. I've never been in, I know what they are by name, but I've never seen it, never been on it. I don't even know what it looks like. I have no idea. I don't want to know. It doesn't interest me at all. But that's me. That's my idiosyncrasy. But all these people who call themselves on the left now calling for Facebook to censor, calling for Twitter to censor. These are not people of the left. These are right-wingers calling themselves leftists. That's not a left value to censor. A left value is truth. How can you acquire truth if you enforce censorship? I mean, that for me is a left value. And anyhow, it's not even a question of me of left, right. It's a question of navigating through life. It's a simple question. John Stuart Mill, at one point in On Liberty, he says, in the opinion not of bad men, but the best of men, nothing which is contrary to truth is useful. In the opinion not of bad men, but the best of men, nothing which is contrary to truth is useful. It's a question. How do you want to navigate through life? Do you want to navigate through life via lies? You want to live a falsehood? Is that what you prefer? Or do you prefer, as the expression has it, truth is often a bitter pill to swallow? Truth is not always a feel-good. A lot of these students' organizations and student groups, they say, oh, what he or she says, or what that organization says, They don't make me feel good. And so it should be censored because you don't feel good. Is that what you're in college for? You're going there to feel good? Or are you going there to try to find truth? And truth is often a bitter pill to swallow. It's not always going to make you feel good. So all of these demands now, beyond being contrary to pursuit of truth, beyond being a practical disaster because they end up backfiring in your face. The third thing is they're so infantilizing. They're so disrespectful of you as adults. Because say I was 6 years old, right? I watched Peter Pan. Those of you who know, in my day it was with Mary Martin, played Peter Pan. I watched Peter Pan. It's about a person who doesn't want to grow up. Okay? And after I watched Peter Pan, I ran to my mother. I remember still to this day, I was like 5, 6 years old. I ran to my mother in her bedroom. I said, Mommy, am I going to die? And she said, no, you're not going to die. And it was a huge relief for me. Okay, a parent says a white lie when you're 5 or 6 years old. But I have my visitors here now, so you'll allow me just to finish up. Give me 1 second. So you say that to a 5 or 6 year old, but what does it say when people are demanding that you say that to adults, students like yourselves, that they should only hear what makes them feel good? That's not an adult. It's completely infantilizing of the student body when they are restricted to only hearing what makes them or a particular group of them feel good, and that to impose censorship on whatever makes them feel bad. Now, folks, I have some visitors now, and so I'm going to have to end this, but I thank you for your time, and I hope it was useful to you.